Welcome to this session, which is titled Paediatric Physiology Responses According to Age. This is part of this training module, which has in essence taken us on a journey from the principles of training through to understanding some of the negative consequences with underperformance syndrome, all the way through to evaluating warm-up. Now we're going to just deal with a particular population group, which in this case is children, and start to think not necessarily about the acute or chronic adaptations to exercise in this group, but start to think about the way in which we can prescribe exercise and what some of the potential pitfalls are when working with this quite unique population group. So let's think about what we're going to cover. Well, fundamentally, we're going to start off by just reflecting on the morphological development of the child. So we're going to break these down a little bit because the morphology is perhaps the area that gets the greatest attention, particularly when you think about the notion of pediatric development, and we think about that the manifestation of growth going from a very tiny baby, and actually that level of growth that we get in the early years is enormous. But understanding the way we get morphological adaptation and also the neurological adaptation that goes with that, but then start to address these in relation to key biological adaptations. And then we'll get these in relation to the notion of what we would call the child athlete. The child athlete is a very broad term, but fundamentally in relation to any child that is doing exercise or physical activity. So let's start by perhaps understanding some of the key terminology or taxonomy here that surrounds the notion of growth, maturation and development. And understanding these actually really helps us understand the journey that we're about to go on throughout the course of this session. And if we keep these kind of in play, it really does explain kind of how sometimes they get a little bit confused. So the first thing is this: look, growth refers simply to measurable changes. So that could be in things like size. It could be in relation to body composition. That's the two obvious ones that we think about. So, for example, we know about height changes and we know about mass changes. But it's also the notion of the various bodily systems changing as well. The difference is maturation refers to progress towards the mature state. So we go through growth, but fundamentally maturation is when we've got to maturity. Growth is therefore not the same as maturation. And so we have to separate those two out. And remember that really, as we are going through growth, we fundamentally are driving towards that process of adolescence and therefore the process of maturation. The key thing to understand, though, is we can think about maturation when we tend to think about growth spurts as a prime example. We tend to think about going from childhood into adolescence. And what we start to think about is, well, they've hit maturity, they're mature. But actually, different biological systems respond at very, very different rates. So actually, some of our bodily systems have hit their stage of maturation, where others are still in that stage of development, and therefore in that stage of growth. And it's really important to understand that, because I think understanding and getting that clear kind of brings to fore this notion of slightly more holistic in terms of our understanding. That there isn't a one whole body response here. That although we might see this at a macro level, particularly when we see adolescents' growth spurts, and we think, gosh, there's been an enormous change. There very well has been an enormous change, particularly in stature. But actually, there may already be bodily systems that have reached their maturation level before that growth spurt has taken place. So, if we put this into context, this perhaps explains a little bit about what's going on. If we take growth rate in terms of stature, so height, what we know is it's the highest during the first year of life. So that's fundamentally, when you look proportionally at the rate of change in height, it is the fastest, even higher in the first year of life than it even is, for example, when you get that growth spurt. And then it starts to decline until what we call the onset, the takeoff of the adolescent growth spurt. Now, it's about 10 years in girls and 12 years in boys. Now, you do get an acceleration, and you will get outliers in this, but fundamentally the degree of change is not as much as it is in that first year, proportionally to the overall height in the individual. And what we get is we get the growth spurt, you get this growth increase, and you reach what is called a peak height velocity. So that is the fastest change in height. And it's at about 12 years in girls and about 14 years in boys. And then it starts to decline once you get to the adult state. So what this tells us is quite important, is it tells us that the rate of change, in this case in height, and this can be applied to all bodily systems, is not uniform. And it also tells us that there are different peaks when this happens. We can see in this example here that there's a sudden acceleration in the first year of life, and then you get this point, it starts to decline until you get to this takeoff point, which is where the growth spurt starts to occur, and it starts to accelerate. And then we get this sudden surge, which is the peak height velocity, which is the fastest rate of change, and then it starts to decline. So there are peaks and troughs, in this case, in the change of height. As you'll see, there are things like mass and strength and so on.